I'm here today with Ed Pavlić to talk about his book, Who Can Afford to Improvise? James Baldwin, Black Music, the Lyric and the Listener. Ed, thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
I want to start with a kind of low tone. This is my favorite book I've read in over 5 years.
Yes.
So I'm very excited to explore, and not just because of my fondness for music, because of what you're exploring that has very, very broad implications for social science, particularly in a time when people are very unsettled and have no sense of the direction forward. Baldwin, in 1963, made a documentary in San Francisco that was very vivid and, how would I say, very confrontational. About the same time, he was meeting with Robert Kennedy and some of his friends, and it was, by all reports, a rather acrimonious meeting. And what interested me right at the outset of your book was that the way in which he talked about could a black man be president of the United States in San Francisco was almost the other side of the debate that he had with Robert Kennedy.
The meeting was the 24th of May, 1963. It took place in the Kennedy apartment here, just south of Central Park in Manhattan. And the filming of Take This Hammer, the film that Baldwin made in San Francisco, was the previous week. And during that week is from that week comes the film we all recognize from Birmingham and the civil rights movement, with the fire hoses in the park and the kids running with the fire hoses against them. So all that footage kind of tangles up in the same historical, like precise historical moments. You have violence in the streets in Birmingham. You have Baldwin making this kind of documentary film about racial dynamics and racism in San Francisco, a place, not identified with those kinds of realities in American life, unlike Birmingham. And then you have his kind of making overtures to Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States at the time, to intercede in Birmingham, to bring federal force to bear upon the violence, racial violence going on at the moment. Also that week, 17th of May, 1963, Baldwin's on the cover of Time magazine, his portrait's on the cover, and it's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation. So, a lot going on. So owing to all those convergences, Baldwin's fame, this historical moment, the 100th anniversary, plus this contemporary violence going on in Alabama, he was able to get noticed by and get the ear of the Attorney General, who then accepted this meeting. And so they met, Baldwin, RFK, and then Baldwin brought along, a good half dozen, maybe more than a half dozen friends and entertainers, thinkers, writers, along with him to kind of to inform the Attorney General about the various dimensions of what was going on and try to convince him to make a stronger federal intervention in that situation. And what they found was a kind of almost total inability to communicate.
It's like ships passing in the night. Right?
Yeah, or ships colliding in the night and sinking. And so Baldwin says, in retrospect then, and Lorraine Hansberry, the great African-American intellectual, progressive activist and playwright, was in that meeting as well. And he says, the meeting took place in that panic-stricken vacuum where black and white meet in this country. This is what Baldwin said in retrospect about meeting the Attorney General. And so a lot of the book takes place in that kind of space, and there's the space that goes between various facets of American life which carry a black label or a white label, and what happens when those two dimensions of our culture or dimensions of our own being try to communicate to each other. Because that panic-stricken vacuum in which black and white meet that Baldwin talked about in that meeting with Bobby Kennedy is something that goes on between black and white people when they meet. What do we talk about? How do we communicate? Do we say anything? But also is something that Baldwin understood as happening within each person themselves, no matter what their racial tag, black, white, or otherwise is. If you're operating with an American sensibility, and that's a global phenomenon because of American empire. Yeah. If you're operating with an American sensibility, you're operating with a multiracial set of constituent elements, or whatever you want to call it. Blackness and whiteness are absolutely not phenomenon that you can divide into neighborhoods, individual people, families, communities, cities. These are codes that permeate our lives. And there are codes that are in conflict, and codes that don't exactly know how to communicate, even when, maybe especially when, they're operating in the life of one person. You understand what I mean? So there's the great African-American philosopher and writer from the early 20th century, W.B. Du Bois, arguably the most important black writer of the 20th century. And he formulated this idea of double consciousness, which is a very famous idea now, that there's a white and a black sensibility in American life, in black life for sure, a doubly conscious person. And in black America, you have both as a culture and an individual case, a person is doubly conscious, has both a black and white sensibility, which have to somehow coexist. And Du Bois talks about the difficulty of that, the pain of that, but he also talks about a person in that situation gifted with second sight, right? And so it's a trial, it's a challenge, but it's also a gift.
How did he turn to the musical, lyrical, consciously to what you might call address this challenge?
Well, Baldwin knew that for all of American history, and before the United States was a country, there was a tradition, a performative tradition, a tradition of artistic creation in African American music that told a story of unique complexity, of unique depth, and because of the economic and social position of black people in this country early on, of unique kind of fundamental power, that black music coming that route in history had recorded levels of American experience and produced order and a certain kind of synthesis of American reality.
And can permeate people's resistances.
Yes, and could communicate that reality.
Yeah.
And that synthesis in such a way that probably no other American voice or discourse could do. And so he came and went from black musical performances, recorded and live, and from his relationship to performers, of whom we could name many, many. He came and went from the logic of black music into print and into spoken performances before cameras, like on that film, or before in talk shows and so forth, almost on a minute-by-minute basis. I think he wrote many times in different ways that much of what he was doing as an artist was translating a kind of unspoken logic, an unspoken structure deep in black music into what he called the disastrously explicit medium of printed language. July 1st, I think, 1973, Baldwin and Ray Charles performed together on stage in a kind of variety show to do what exactly? I'm not sure anyone really knew. But certainly in Jimmy's mind, it was about attracting people to the sound of Ray Charles. And I think attracting people to kind of unawares maybe of what they might encounter near the sound of Ray Charles, if that makes sense. So to bring Ray's audience into the room by the thousands, to hear the singer they loved, and then to kind of unpack what's going on in that music in ways that connected explicitly to the politics of their own lives and our world at the time.
Yeah, it's choosing a path not of romantic delusion,
right,
but of going deeper into that politics of their lives.
Because, of course, for Baldwin, in all of black music, but in Ray Charles' voice very powerfully, was a political dimension that rarely got made explicit. And so in the history of black music, you have a long tradition of voicing various things at once, and of carrying out explicitly political, in fact, at some point, incendiary political messages, but coding them in ways that a large audience would not be troubled by. And so you have in the narrative of Frederick Douglass from the 19th century, where Frederick Douglass is listening to the slaves sing songs of sorrow, songs of communication from one plantation to another, often songs coded in information about the Underground Railroad, songs about how to pace work in a way that doesn't kill people, songs about pace and rhythm, songs of tactical survival, songs of tactical rebellion. And what white people heard in the telling of Frederick Douglass, what white people heard when they listened to that was happy people. People thanking God for his providence in bringing them here to this happy place to be. And so, there's a very sinister thing going on there in some ways, is that you have a music which is forced to dissemble itself. It's forced really on the punishment of death to dissemble some of what it's about. And that tradition carries over to today.
Well, as we at the Institute for New Economic Thinking are working in this highly polarized world, this dysfunctional world, this world where fear is building walls in compartments rather than bridges, I would invoke that statement at the end of Just Above My Head about there's nobody up the road but just us.
But us, right.
Well, getting to know you and having this discussion, that feels pretty good to me. If the people up the road are just like you, that's reassuring, because I think you're pulling things in a direction that economists, social scientists, politicians, psychologists, whoever, can learn from. And I don't think this is a book about James Baldwin. I don't think this is a book about music. It's about all of those things. But this is a book about the challenges that we face putting this world together for our children.
It's about us. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure.